Thank you. Good afternoon. I was a high-level Church of Scientology staff member for 27 years. I left in December of 2004. Do I need to wait for you? No? Okay. In the year 2000, there was a distinct point where the leader of Scientology, David Miscavige, who had really solidified his power in an unquestioning fashion. And when he did so, he became increasingly more sociopathic, violent. He started creating a real dangerous cult situation at the international headquarters just outside of Los Angeles. I had been gone for 14 months in Clearwater working on other business and returned in late 2003 to find what I described then as an apocalypse now sort of situation, where virtually all of international management was locked up in a room about the size of this room right here, and there was 80 people forced to live there 24/7, sleep on the floors, have their food brought up to them, weren't allowed to leave for any reason. For day after day after day, the people were engaging in group confessions where people would have to get up, much like a North Korea POW camp, where people were gotten to get up in front of the rest of the people in the room and confess thought crimes against David Miscavige. And if the thought crimes were not juicy enough, or they did not, he didn't think they were revelatory enough, or they didn't match what he considered they ought to be, people were subjected to physical punishments. David Miscavige started it, physically beating people, physically strangling people, kicking people, and into December of December of 03 into January of 04, he then required that others do the same to others. Do I need to break it all, or do you?
Yeah.
Huh? Yeah.
Let's have a break for a short translation.
Okay. Two events happened at that time that led to me leaving the organization. I've spoke of one publicly before, and the other one occurred to me as I went through this for another time for Mrs. Coberta. First was my own activity in being involved in this. I was assigned specifically to physically beat Mike Rinder, who was the international spokesperson for Scientology, and I was assigned to do that by Miscavige because allegedly I would be the only person that would understand what his crimes are, because I worked closely with him on external facing matters. And Mike was a good friend of mine. I had worked closely with him for 2 decades, and I literally had him by the lapels. You want to continue? And I was shaking him and bouncing him off the floor. And for a moment, I kind of realized, I said, you know, this is so against my own nature. And I realized after 27 years, here I'm doing something that is so violently against my own nature and my own judgment that it made me pause and think and realize that, you know, there was something seriously wrong with my mind at that moment. And then it was about 2 days later that another event occurred, and that was another close friend of mine by the name of Tom DeVocht, who was a high Scientology manager, was brought before the entire group of 80 people. Was I going before? Okay. And in order to make an example of him, Miscavige beat him ruthlessly in front of everybody with fists to the face, to the stomach, beat him to the ground, and began to kick him while he was on the ground. And I realized right then I either had to do something that I would probably regret in order to prevent this or to retaliate for it, or I'd have to remove myself from the environment. And so I decided right then and there to remove myself from the environment, and I essentially escaped from the international headquarters on my motorcycle, which is a whole story in itself, but that's essentially what occurred. for 3 years, I moved to the very south part of Texas near the border of Mexico because I just wanted to disappear and I didn't want to do any damage to Scientology, because even after I left, I never had any doubts about what I had gotten from the actual philosophy or the technology of Scientology. I was always able to differentiate that from the activity of the leader and the organization. But I was disconnected from anything to do with the organization for 3 years, and about that time, old friends found me who had followed suit and left the organization. And I learned in the year 2008 going to 2009 that in the years that followed, this scenario that I just described to you about what was going on at the international headquarters had actually deteriorated far beyond that. Mike Rinder left in 2007, and Tom DeVock left after I did, and Mark Headley, who's been here to Germany and spoke, and left after I did. And they described a scene that went beyond what I just did. People were literally being tortured at the direction of David Miscavige in the International Management headquarters. And I first spoke out in mid-2009 about what was going on, and at the time my motivation was that I was truly concerned that this was going to deteriorate into a Jonestown or a Waco or some huge infamous cult conflagration. That was my initial motivation. Because I did not attack the principles of Scientology, because I still had respect for them, something unprecedented happened, and that is that Scientologists who were supporting the organization began to read the newspaper articles. And something unprecedented then happened because of that, which has been occurring over the past year and a half, and that is that information about what really goes on at the top, what really gets done with the money, how people are being deceived, how they're being used and abused, is getting to active Scientologists. And what is occurring is, probably with greater speed than ever before, a lot of their support is leaving. People have described it as an exodus. And as they leave, there's more testimonies that come out about, that corroborate what I've been saying. It's gotten to a point where this was an unintended consequence, but this is just what occurred, that they have now appointed me as evil on the level of Mrs. Caberta, and pursue me every day. For the last 140 days, my wife and I have had a group of 6 to 8 of them in front of our house 2 or 3 times a day, screaming at us when we leave. Everywhere I go in the United States, when I go by airline, they hack into the airline computers and they have teams of PIs waiting at the airports. They even knew about my Hamburg trip, even though I told nobody about it. Clearly by the same method, 3 days before me leaving, they showed up at my house protesting that fact. They have, it's kind of ironic that they're outside in front right now playing out the Grand Inquisition. They're trying to position me as a heretic because I'm telling people that they don't need that organization, they don't need the cult, they don't need the mind control, they don't need to go bankrupt, they don't need to be forced into disconnecting from family members, they don't need to go through any of that in order to read the material, because all of the material is out there and available. Scientologists don't understand that are involved with the church. They think that their immortal future is is being held by David Miscavige, this individual that I've described to you as a sociopath and a violent one at that. So I think that message, I thought that was a vital message to be gotten out in Germany, because they are so well trained to stay away from the media and not look at what they call attacks on Scientology. And I think it's significant that you might have a readership and the word might get around to people that you never got through to before because of the way I'm approaching this. Specifically as it relates to Germany, I've had the opportunity to talk to Mrs. Caberta, and and find out that, you know, a lot of the propaganda the church has put out about her, predictably, is not true. She holds nothing against me for continuing to consider Scientology philosophy something that's useful to me and something that I believe is useful to others, and I actually do that for my living. I counsel people using Scientology. And I thought one thing that was of interest and importance to her was to share the church's strategy and how they came about getting the United States government to go after her and go after Germany as a whole, to try to position them as some sort of totalitarian, intolerant country that was living out, you know, some kind of chapters from the past. I find it extremely hypocritical that the U.S. government is doing the bidding of somebody who is probably the most intolerant, totalitarian individual I've ever met in my life, to try to use that exact positioning against others, particularly when I come here and I find that the allegations they're making are not based on fact. David Miscavige knows virtually nothing about Germany, and yet, and this is true of a lot of things that he does, and yet he was the one that just off the cuff came up with the positioning to make them, to position them with 1930s Germany. And then untold sums of money were spent in forwarding that positioning and convincing the United States government to believe that it's true. Celebrities were pulled out. Greta Van Susteren, Fox News analyst, was a good friend with the Clintons, spent many nights at personal dinners at the White House during their administration, educating them, quote unquote, on Scientology in Germany. Secretary of Defense Cohen, at the time, was a neighbor and a personal friend of Tom Cruise, who got, quote unquote, educated on Germany and Scientology. John Travolta, of course, had a direct communication line to Clinton and used that to, quote unquote, educate him on Scientology in Germany. Ann Archer spent 2 hours in the Oval Office with Bill Clinton. Ann Archer is the actress and the mother of the church's current international spokesperson, Tommy Davis. A lot was invested into PR firms and law firms, and tremendous sums of money have been paid to the Washington, D.C. law firm of Williams & Connolly, which serves as the personal attorney for David Miscavige and has since the 1980s, who also happen to represent both of the Clintons themselves personally on their book deals, also on the Lewinsky scandal, the current Attorney General, Eric Holder, and his problems that he's had, and virtually a whole who's list of the hierarchy of the Clinton machine. So this was, a tremendous amount of money was spent, a tremendous amount of influence was used with celebrities, and again, I think that is why this is a continuing situation. I think there was a bit of a respite during the Bush years, not that I'm a big Bush fan, and I'm not, but they didn't have the access that they had during the 90s, but they've got it again, because if you look at the roster, at who the Secretary of State is now and who holds all the cabinet positions, it's the same old crowd that the church has spent 15 to 20 years investing in to push this campaign, which again, at the end of the day, is about as hypocritical a campaign as you could imagine, because virtually, if you listen to what I've described on how Scientology is run from the very top, they literally are accusing you of that which Miscavige himself is doing. I've been asked what is the most effective action to take to curb abuses of the Church of Scientology, and the answer is pretty simple. It is to focus on the money, because this is where the greatest abuse comes from. This is the motivation that really is behind the abuses that are most affecting people. People are being driven into bankruptcy, people are being driven into losing their homes because there's a tremendous drive and a tremendous push to get people to just give money to the church. Not for services or anything else, just give money for their war chest, for their buildings, or for whatever. And two, to stay focused on where this comes from. It comes from the top. I mean, there's not a single Scientologist, I think, in Hamburg that if they were sitting in the room face to face with me that I wouldn't enjoy and get along with, and I don't think you would have that problem either. Absent the indoctrination into the abusive practices that are now become common and have become overriding within the church. That's been my general advice. And I think that's it. We can open it up for questions.